We plan out podcast episodes in advance, so this episode has been in the queue for months now. But I always love it when I get multiple pings or signs that something that I'm thinking about or wanting to do is definitely the next right step. In the last couple of weeks, I've had three previous clients reach out to me with questions about upcoming travel to Europe. I even bumped into a client over Thanksgiving while I was in Florida, and he mentioned that they were headed to Europe this summer, and he was hoping that I would create some sort of training or workshop around handling sleep when traveling from the US to Europe. So here we are on the podcast. Today, I'm going to share what I've learned after traveling to Europe with young kids twice. If you're planning or hoping to plan a trip to Europe, this episode is for you. Hi, I'm Allison Egidi, a pediatric sleep and wellness coach and a mom of two. I love to help parents find solutions. This is How Long Till Bedtime. Before I had kids and during my first 2 years of being a parent, I thought having kids on a super consistent sleep schedule and being, quote, hardcore about sleep would make things like traveling harder. What I finally learned after a stressful 2 years and then ultimately giving in and committing to consistency and a schedule was that having children with solid and consistent sleep habits gave us so much more freedom and made traveling a lot more fun. Once we had both girls sleeping well and came to understand that Addison has a sensitive circadian rhythm and is very affected by not getting enough sleep or getting off schedule. And then realizing that Ainsley is more flexible, bounces back faster when it comes to things being off with her sleep, but she also has pretty high sleep needs. After learning all that, we started to travel much more. But we made travel plans and planned out our days with that knowledge, with the knowledge of knowing what would allow each of our girls to thrive during the trip. Because if there is one thing I learned during those 2 years of not managing sleep well, it is that having an overtired child is one of the fastest ways for a trip or vacation to go south and to leave you feeling like you never should have left home. After gaining lots of confidence with our domestic travels, we agreed to head to Italy with Mike's family back in 2019. The girls were 4 and 6 years old at the time. We were so excited because Mike and I love Italy. We actually got engaged there. But I was really nervous because we weren't the ones planning out the itinerary. So, to settle my own anxiety, I decided on my own priorities ahead of the trip. And I would say that was mainly if things weren't going well, I was going to pull the plug on virtually anything. And the trip was a smashing success. We truly had the most amazing time, and the kids did better than I could have ever imagined. And then last year, when the girls were 8 and 10 years old, Mike and I took them to France. So here's what I've learned traveling to Europe with young kids. First, adjusting to the time difference going from the United States to Europe is easier than when you come back from Europe and then you need to adjust to the time in the US. Adjusting to the new time is typically what parents are most anxious about if they haven't headed to Europe before with their kids. So I share that because I want to assure you that this is the easier direction, which is great because you're trying to get there and make the most of your short time over there. And I have two big tips as it relates to adjusting your kids to the new time zone. First, Those overnight flights are a solid way to go. I don't want you to fear them, which is a little bit what I was feeling the first time of like, oh my gosh, it's overnight. It's when the kids should be sleeping. It's obviously not even the full length of the night that my kids would typically get of sleep. I think it was 7 hours compared to their 11 or 12 hours. And so I was really anxious about it because we'd land there and it would be morning. This is not a bad thing. So please do not fear those overnight flights. For those of us on the East Coast, most of those flights are often right around 7 p.m., which is when many of your kids would typically be going to bed. So have your child in their jammies or their super comfy clothes and try to get them to sleep as fast as possible when that flight takes off. If you have a preschooler or an elementary age child, coach them on this in advance. Explain that you're going to be flying overnight and it's really important that they sleep because it's going to be morning when you arrive in Europe. So, when my girls were 4 and 6, part of that explanation meant we're going to feed you dinner at the airport before we get on the plane. So, you're not going to stay awake for when they serve dinner on the plane and you're not going to watch the TVs on the plane. Those were the big things we had to cover when they were 4 and 6. And I would say that they had an easier time sleeping the whole way over when they were 4 and 6 than they did when they were 8 and 10. Because when they were 4 and 6, they were right around their bedtime when we took off, and they literally slept the entire flight. The flight attendants had to insist that I wake them up at some point as we were getting ready to start the descent. When we went to France this past year, Ainsley slept most of the way, but Addison, who now has a little bit later bedtime, struggled because she wasn't quite ready to go to sleep when we took off. And then she started watching a movie to kill time, which makes sense, until it was closer to her normal bedtime. And then she just had a really hard time getting to sleep after that. I think because once the screens got involved, it got trickier. But whether sleep on the plane goes well or doesn't go well, I want to encourage you to try to adjust your child to the new time immediately when you get to Europe. Typically, you're going to arrive in the morning if you took that overnight flight, which of course is still in the middle of the night back in the US. If you have a child who's still napping, go ahead and let them sleep during their typical nap period that first day. So let's say they're on one nap and that nap typically happens around 12 p.m. back home. Allow them to nap at 12 p.m. local time in Europe, but be sure to wake them if they're trying to take a longer nap because they're trying to catch up on some of their missed sleep from the night before and their body is totally discombobulated. And then whether that nap or the naps, if they take multiple naps a day, go well or not, forge ahead to bedtime. Your child is going to catch a second wind at some point in the afternoon because it's going to be daytime back in the US. Bedtime is another area that parents worry about when they're heading from the US to Europe because restaurants typically open much later in Europe. For many, the first seating is going to be 7 p.m. Both times that we took our girls over to Europe, I was able to adjust their schedules so that they went to bed later than they would at home and they woke later than usual. This works when you're heading that direction. Even for kids who are typically very early risers, like my daughter Addison was at that time when we went to Italy, you can usually get away with this adjusted later schedule for 7 to 10 days before their body is going to typically start to go back to their earlier waking. When my girls were 4 and 6, their typical bedtime was 7. And when we had them over in Italy, I only adjusted them so that their bedtime was 8:30 or 9, and then they would sleep until 8 or 8:30 the next morning. This worked really well until the last few days of our 14-day trip, and then they both started to wake earlier. So I want to say we got about 10 solid days where they were able to go to bed later. In many cases, you're going to need to wake your child up in the morning those first few days because their body thinks it's the middle of the night based on US time. And even if they have a hard time getting to sleep that very first night, I recommend waking them by 8:30 in the morning, and then I want you to get them dressed and get them outside as soon as you can. Exposing their and your body to natural lights, natural sunlight early in the morning is one of the very best ways to help bodies adjust their circadian rhythm to this new time. We want the body to be exposed to the sun in the morning and in the afternoon. Typically, when you're traveling, you'll be outside a lot, which is great. And that's another thing I should have mentioned when you arrive on day one. Try to be outside in the afternoon, mid to late afternoon, so that your eyes can take in where the sun is as it's coming down and start to note that things have changed. So, a lot of outdoor natural light exposure is helpful. So, back to the bedtime and waking them, a quick little side story. While my girls slept great on that flight to Italy when they were 4 and 6 years old, they obviously only had somewhere between 6 and 7 hours of sleep compared to their normal 11 to 12 hours. But I kept them up the entire day because at that point, neither of them were napping. I kept them up the whole day we were in Italy. They did catch a second wind, and we did go out to dinner, and we got home, and Addison crashed sometime between 8:30 and 9 p.m. As soon as we put her in the bed, she crashed, which I was kind of surprised because she's my more sensitive child. But she was exhausted. She crashed, slept all night. Poor Ainsley, my more flexible child, didn't fall asleep until 1 a.m., which was 7 p.m. back home. So her body was still operating on US time, even though she had to have been so tired. This just shows the power of a circadian rhythm, you guys. So she was up until 1 a.m., very frustrated that she couldn't sleep. Ultimately got to sleep at 1, and I still woke her at 8:30 the next morning because I wanted to adjust her quickly. I didn't want us to lose time on this trip, and I wanted to help her adjust and maximize her sleep as fast as possible. I woke her up at 8:30. She wasn't happy about it. We got outside. We were outside most of the whole day, that first full day. And then she slept great the following night and going forward the rest of the trip. So even if that first night your kids struggle to go to sleep because their body thinks it's now daytime when you're trying to have them go to bed, wake them up the next morning. Let me jump back to the later bedtimes for a minute. As I mentioned, there's a good chance that you can just partially adjust your child to the new time and keep a later bedtime to make it easier to go out to eat. But this leads me to maybe my biggest tip I have for you all for a fun-filled trip to Europe with young kids. Be willing to pull the plug on going out to dinner. With both of our trips to Europe, we had dinner plans scheduled for every night. And this was one of the things, particularly when the girls were 4 and 6, that I was most anxious about having out of my control. And of course, most of the times we were booked at the earliest seating, but during each trip, there were nights where one of our kids was not in a good place for going out to dinner. So I was always mentally prepared to pull the plug on dinner and willing to stay back at the hotel with one or both of our girls. This was how I put my anxiety at ease before we went to Italy that first time. Was that if things weren't going well, the one place I had control to make an adjustment was to just not go to dinner. And during each trip, both when they were 4 and 6 and when they were 8 and 10, I don't recall having nights where both girls were clearly exhausted and shouldn't be going to dinner. But there were nights where it was clear that one was. And it was Ainsley, my more flexible child, but she's also my introvert. So I think being on a big trip where we're out and about and being exposed to people constantly is exhausting to her. So I would stay back at the hotel with her so that she could eat early and go to bed. And then Mike took Addison out to dinner. When we were in Italy, it was just out with his family. When we were in France, just the two of them went out. So we each kind of got some one on one time with the kids, and it was great. I mean, yes, I was a little bit bummed to miss some dinners because I'm a food girl and I always like to go out and try new restaurants. But I would have been way more bummed to have a crumbling child the whole next day. So, therefore, one of my biggest pieces of advice that I could give to you is to be willing to pull an audible, to pull the plug on dinner at a restaurant when needed, and be willing to let some of your crew forge ahead while others stay back. I truly think that this was one of the biggest reasons our two trips were a huge success, and we all came home feeling like we had the best time both times. So, those are my biggest tips for traveling to Europe with kids. Adjust your children to the new time zone right away when you arrive. You can, however, probably only adjust them part of the way by going with a later bedtime and allowing them to sleep later in the morning than they usually would at home. But remember that the goal is for them to still get their typical amount of sleep. So if they aren't sleeping later in the morning than they typically would, I do recommend that you move that bedtime up earlier so they are getting the correct amount of sleep. And if you have a day where the wheels are coming off, pull the plug on going out to dinner and let everyone get the sleep they need. Get your child to bed earlier. Reset so that your whole family doesn't pay the price the next day because someone is overtired. Mike and I have loved traveling to Europe with our kids, and both times we were thrilled with how well they did, and we both times came home thinking we can't wait to go back. We're actually heading back to Italy this summer. After we got back from France this past year, I did write a blog post about traveling to Paris with kids. It includes packing tips with items I think you should definitely consider taking and things to do with your kids while in Paris. So I will link to that in the show notes, or you can find it at www.sleepandwellnesscoach.com/Paris with kids. I'd love to hear about upcoming trips you have to Europe or your experience traveling to Europe with young kids. Shoot me a DM on Instagram and share what helped you have a great trip or what made it challenging. My handle is at Sleep and Wellness Coach. I'll see you back here next week. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to How Long Till Bedtime. To learn how we can work together to improve your child's sleep, please visit sleepandwellnesscoach.com.